Um, I believe other federal prosecutors who were originally in charge of Henry's drug case, the heroin case that which he was arrested for, when they learned that Henry had information on the Lufthansa case, extensive information, did they turn him over to you as a professional courtesy? Were they obligated to turn him over to you, or did you yourself intercede?
Okay, well, I'll tell you the story of how Henry became a witness and went into the witness protection program under my sponsorship. Henry was the target. Well, first of all, we understood that Henry had been involved to some extent in the Lufthansa robbery. We didn't know the full role or the complete role that he had played in the robbery, or what role he played in the robbery in its planning. And at one point we actually subpoenaed Henry, probably sometime 6 months to a year after the robbery, when we began to run into some stone walls. We weren't being very successful.
Prior to his arrest,
long before his arrest
on the drug charge.
Remember, we were able to convict relatively quickly the inside man, who was a Lufthansa employee, Lou Werner.
Right.
And we used another Lufthansa employee who was involved with Werner named Peter Grunwald.
Right.
Grunwald went into the program, was not prosecuted, received immunity. Werner received I believe he received a 10-year prison sentence. I tried that case, exactly. And he was convicted. I believe in 1979. By 1980, we weren't proving to be very successful in going after the people who were responsible for the robbery, primarily because it was difficult investigating the case. But the most important reason for why it was difficult to investigate the case is that many of the people involved in the robbery were executed.
He was right.
And,
Eliminated, right.
So any of the potential witnesses we had were no longer available. As a matter of fact, as sort of an interesting anecdote, the informant information that we had was that Lou Werner's contact, his underworld contact when they were planning the robbery, was a guy named Joe Manriquez, or Joe Manriquez.
Right.
He and Frenchie McMahon, who was his friend, were found murdered the morning after Lou Werner was convicted. The anticipation of the mob, obviously, being that if Werner was convicted, was facing a heavy prison sentence, he would cooperate.
Why didn't he?
The people he would cooperate against would be Manriquez and possibly.
And why didn't Werner?
He did cooperate eventually. He cooperated after his appeal was affirmed. That was probably in the summer of 1980. When his appeal was affirmed. By that time, Henry was already cooperating, and Werner's cooperation really only went to Manriquez and possibly to McMahon, and they were sort of blocked off. We couldn't go from Henry to those guys because they were both dead. And so it turned out that Werner had very little to offer. He gave us everything we had. We believed he was telling the truth, but the sentencing judge, Judge Costantino, refused to give him a break, and he ended up serving the full sentence. In those days, you got parole relatively early on. Today, of course,
the federal sentencing guidelines did provide for parole.
Right, until the sentencing guidelines went into effect in 1987. So until 1987, if you were sentenced under the old law, you could be paroled after a third or half of your sentence. So Werner did probably 3 or 4 years in jail, and then went into the witness protection program because it was well known that he had cooperated. It was a matter of public record when we went to get a lighter sentence for him. So in any event, that was sort of the background. We had convicted Werner, the inside man. Other people who were potential witnesses who had involvement in the robbery and had knowledge about how the robbery had been committed. Many of them had been executed, whether to quiet them or to prevent them from taking a share that they would have been entitled to.
Which Burke was adamant about sharing?
Well, I never spoke to Burke, so I don't know exactly what it was. I mean, I know that according to what Henry Hill said, Burke was not enthusiastic about sharing money with many people. He wanted to keep as much as he could for himself, and also to pay tribute to major organized crime figures. But in any case, it gets us to Henry. Henry was somebody we knew who had been involved in the robbery, but we didn't have anything to really grab him on. We didn't have any proof of his involvement in the robbery or any other criminal activity. But at the time, throughout 1980 and probably the latter part of 1979, Henry was the subject of a narcotics investigation, not by the federal government, but by the Nassau County District Attorney's Office and the Nassau County Police Department. And so, in the spring, excuse me, the spring of 1980, Henry was arrested by the Nassau County authorities, and was prosecuted, was indicted on a number of narcotics charges. I think there were 9 separate counts for which Henry could have been sentenced to life in prison under the old Rockefeller law.
Correct.
In addition, his wife Karen was indicted. And on a number of Rockefeller law counts, and he was facing life in prison, and she was facing life in prison as well. Henry was on parole, and when he was arrested by the Nassau County authorities, he had to get in touch with his parole officer. His federal parole officer was a fellow by the name of Jimmy Fox. Jim Fox subsequently, 10, 12 years later, became the head of probation in the Eastern District of New York. Was a very, very outstanding law enforcement officer, and ended up years later was running a major basketball program on Long Island. He was very active in the community. He was a great guy. He was Henry's parole officer, and when he went out to speak to Henry, he began to talk to Henry about the possibility of cooperating. And there were a few conversations.
At this time, Henry was still sitting in the county jail.
And he gave an indication to Fox that he might be willing to cooperate, because he knew, number one, he was facing a lifetime prison sentence, and number two,
they would have killed him.
He expected to very well be killed. And so Fox, you see in the movie Goodfellas that I'm the one who's responsible for turning Henry, and that really wasn't the case. He was turned basically by Jimmy Fox, the probation officer. And Henry had my name, he had the name of the FBI agents who were working with me. And we expected that he would come in pretty quickly, that he would give the final word to Fox, and then the agents would be able to take him out of the prison and bring him down to be interviewed by me. But Henry made bail. And at that point, he was on the streets, and we had to act quickly. And the FBI agents who had spoken to Jim Fox knew that Henry was vulnerable, that he was about to make a decision to cooperate. We suspected that once he made the street, that he would become a fugitive. So what we did was we quickly put together an application to get him arrested as a material witness, because and he was arrested because we were afraid that he was going to flee. And we had reason to believe that he would. He had a brother who was living in California. Henry knew a lot of people, and he had a lot of contacts. So, given the fact that the scuttlebutt in the community, the informant information was that Henry would take off because he was afraid of doing a lifetime sentence, as anybody would be, and he was afraid of being killed. We got this material witness order, and we arrested Henry. And I remember I was called. I was at home. I didn't live far from the courthouse in Brooklyn, and the agents called me, and I went rushing down to the courthouse at about 10 o'clock at night, and I had a conversation with Henry about going into the program. He basically made up his mind. I think that he was still saying, well, I'm not sure. He's trying to cut a deal for himself. He wanted to go back out on the street and be our man in the street, be protected by the FBI, but that wasn't going to fly. And so when he left that night, we had a handshake, and that they took him, the FBI took him and kept him in custody. They took care of him that night. They brought him back the next day. We summoned his wife, and his mother-in-law and father-in-law showed up, and we had the scene that you then saw in Goodfellas,
right.
but with Lorraine Bracco and Ray Liotta. But what was going on outside was that Henry's mother-in-law and father-in-law were there, and they were in a complete state of panic because they were afraid they were going to lose their daughter. Of course, they were also should have been concerned they were going to lose their daughter, who could have gone to jail for many years. Henry's 2 kids were present.
It was a circus.
It was a circus, and his 2 sisters-in-law were also present. So that was sort of left out of the movie, but it was sort of a very, in hindsight, very comical, chaotic scene with the whole family there.
The book Wise Guy expounds with more details on that whole scenario that occurred that day.
Yeah.
Let's take a break. Let's just check and see how the cams are doing.
I can't believe it was 30 years ago.
I'm sorry?
30 years ago.
Yes. but still vivid in your memory.
I remember it very well.
And it must have been very frustrating for you throughout the investigation of the Lufthansa case. As you said, most of the witnesses, if not all the witnesses, or at least the participants, were being killed. Bodies were turning up here and there. You had gained most of the facts to prosecute the participants from Henry Hill, and you could have brought the case to a resolution. Perhaps even recovered some of the money that was taken. So how did you cope with the ultimate dead-end blank outcome? Was it a detriment to your career? Did it enhance your career? Was it a personal or emotional torture? As you just mentioned, at 10 o'clock at night, you ran down to the to lift Henry out to ensure that he would, in fact, agree to enter the program. So you obviously put a lot of personal interest and devotion to the investigation of the case.
Dan, it's funny, as far as it being a detriment to my career or whether I was personally upset about what was going on, I was in a situation, and others in our group, we had an office of 14 lawyers. I was one of the two deputy chiefs. Tom Puccio was the chief of the office. I think I was in prosecutor's heaven. I was responsible for the Lufthansa robbery investigation and the trial of Werner, which was a major prosecution back in 1979. I was also responsible for the prosecution of Alphonse Persico, who was the boss of the Colombo crime family, and I tried him twice. We had a hung jury the first time, or a mistrial the first time, and then I had to try him again. So I was responsible for trying a family boss. And all throughout this period of time, from 1979 into 1982, I was involved in, of all things, the abscam prosecutions. And so I was working on putting together, along with other people in my office, other prosecutors, and Tom Puccio was the boss of the office. I was working on the prosecutions of 4 congressmen and a United States senator. And around the time that Henry was coming in to cooperate, I was preparing the trial of Harrison Williams, who was a United States senator, and which was one of the most important cases in the country at the time. So once Henry began to cooperate, not only did he try to give us information about the Lufthansa robbery, but we had to satisfy ourselves with something that was sort of second best in bringing a case against Jimmy Burke, and that ended up being the Boston College point shaving case. So in a period of 2 or 3 years, I was responsible for working on the prosecution of 4 congressmen, the United States senator, the boss of the Colombo crime family, and the Boston College point shaving case, and Lou Werner, who was the inside man at Lufthansa.
So the Lufthansa case on its own, by itself, was not your magnum opus.
No. I mean, you look back in hindsight, here it is 30 years later, and you sort of scratch your head and you say, there aren't many people who were fortunate enough to have those kinds of opportunities that I was presented with, and they really were opportunities that sort of fell in my lap. It wasn't that I did hard work and these things developed. I just happened to be in the organized crime strike force in Brooklyn, working for a person who was my friend, Tom Puccio, working with other outstanding prosecutors, and we had excellent agents and investigators working with us, and we were able to make these cases. And so you would think for many people that the Lufthansa investigation, the Lufthansa prosecutions would be sort of career cases. The way things just sort of broke for us, it was just one of a group of cases that we had, or that I had.
One great opportunity after the other.
Yeah.
But throughout all the chronicles about the case, the documentary, the film Goodfellas, the 2 books that were written about it, no one ever mentioned the victim itself, Lufthansa. what was Lufthansa doing throughout all this? I mean, were they demanding more action, more answers, more resolution? Were they screaming about the loss of the money? What became of them?
We heard very little from Lufthansa. They had a security officer. I forget exactly what his title was, but they had a series of chiefs of security for the United States operations. They were cooperative in the sense that anytime the FBI or we needed documents or anything like that, they were former New York City detectives. They were very cooperative, or, nice guys. And they were not putting a lot of pressure on us. I mean, they realized these were former detectives, and they realized that many of the links in the sort of evidentiary chain, in our proof chain, were being executed or had been executed. So they realized it was a very difficult
Were
case.
they insured for the theft?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I was going to get to that. They were insured by Lloyd's, and lo and behold, I guess it was in 1984, the lawsuit came to a head in Cologne, Germany, and they made a request. Lufthansa made a request from the Justice Department that I be permitted to go to Germany and appear as a witness in the civil proceedings in Germany. I went to Cologne for prep, met with their attorneys, and then went back over and was available this was a few months later to testify. But while I was at the courthouse, the case was settled, and I never had to appear as a witness.
So would it be safe to say that Lufthansa was ultimately made good? They retrieved their loss or partial loss, or
In Germany, as it is here in many civil cases, the resolutions and settlements are not made public. So,
oh really?
I'm not sure how it worked out. I think that Lloyd's was responsible for paying them for the money that they were out, but I guess it was a question about the amount of jewelry that had been taken and other valuables that had been taken, and that was all something that we were never made privy to. So I'm not sure how it worked out, but I guess either Lloyd's or Lufthansa or a combination of the two of them suffered losses.
True. You were instrumental in arranging for Henry Hill to be accepted into the Witness Protection Program. But even after you almost literally saved his life, he was incorrigible. Was that an embarrassment to you in respect to your career, or in respect to to the people that you had to answer to for his actions or his behavior while he was in the program?
Well, I didn't have to answer to anybody about Henry's actions. I sponsored Henry for the Witness Protection Program. Most of the people who were sponsored by federal prosecutors for the Witness Protection Program were scoundrels. I mean, legitimate people don't go into the Witness Protection Program.
But when you use the term sponsor, does that mean that you guarantee his performance, or?
No. When you sponsor somebody, you simply support his application, but there's no way you can guarantee his performance. You make a presentation to your superiors in Washington saying against whom the prospective participant in the program would be testifying, but you can never guarantee that the person's going to hold up under cross-examination. And very often you put people in the program and then you just end up not using them. I had people I put in the program and didn't use them because.
So you have no regrets about having sponsored them?
I don't have any regrets about Henry. About sponsoring Henry, even though he screwed up when he went into the program, because Henry was an enormously successful witness. He was enormously helpful in making some major prosecutions, and so the government got its money's worth by putting Henry in the Witness Protection Program, despite the fact that he was a headache. I mean, he was a headache in the sense that the first place he went to, he blew his cover. The second place he went to, he blew his cover. Usually it's 2 and out, but by that time, probably by 83 or so, Henry was still testifying in significant cases, was still providing significant information, helping to make investigations, support wiretap applications, search warrant applications. So Henry was still a valuable witness. So we went to Washington in conjunction with the FBI and also with the Drug Enforcement Administration, and we said, look, Henry is still a very valuable witness. Don't kick him out of the program. So he went to his third city. He went to the Seattle area, and was when he got up into the Seattle area was when he really started, or he could have been engaging in criminal activity all along. We don't know. But when he went up to the Seattle area is when he got caught. He got caught with a South American drug ring, and
But he claims he was set up on that particular caper.
well, I don't know what he means by set up, but
He
if
did
there's undercover operatives who are making a case against you, it's your hard luck if you get caught. I mean, everybody who gets arrested and it's sort of in a sting operation claims they've been set up,
course.
but it wasn't like Henry was innocent and was unfairly prosecuted. But he was prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Seattle, and the interesting thing was that I wrote a letter for Henry after. His conviction. He was facing, I think, a 15-year sentence. The prosecutors wanted to throw the book at him. I took no position on his sentence when I wrote the letter for him. I simply summarized the cases in which he had been an effective witness and provided information in some major investigations. And I also mentioned that his life was in danger. And that's, of course, that was why he went into the witness protection program. The judge read the submission that I made, recognized the significance of his contributions as a witness and as a person supplying information, but also took it a step further and read into my letter something that I didn't say, and that is that Henry was under a great deal of psychological pressure because of the danger that he was in, and essentially gave him a lot of credit because of that. And rather than sending him to jail for up to 15 years, he placed him in a narcotics rehabilitation program and gave him a probationary sentence, which is a lot of luck.
So because of the deep mine of evidence that Henry and information that he was able to provide, there was a much higher tolerance of his mischievousness while he was in the program.
Look, I mean, if you're producing, you're going to be more forgiving. That's not to say that Henry wouldn't have been prosecuted for criminal activities in which he was where he was caught, where there was evidence of his criminal activity. In fact, he was prosecuted by I'm not sure it was the Drug Enforcement Administration or the FBI out on the West Coast, and there were other matters where other times when he was arrested for minor things, breaking into grocery stores after the bars had closed, we could get booze and things like that.
Bigamy.
Well, he was never prosecuted for bigamy, but
almost.
But he could have been in that jurisdiction, wherever. I guess he was living in the state of Washington when he committed bigamy.
But he did say that he remarried in a different state. So in his own mind, the second marriage didn't really count.
Well, he couldn't get a different name, so it was the new
It was
identity.
a different name, Marty
the new
Lewis.
Identity, yeah, the new identity was
The new identity.
Get married.
Besides the fact that he was very, very helpful, and he offered and provided a great deal of information and evidence to prosecute very, very important cases, was there another inspiration that you had in becoming his crusader?
I don't like to think of myself as Henry's crusader. I was somebody who was using Henry for the benefit of law enforcement, for the benefit of the Justice Department to try to make cases. I was not on a crusade to try and help Henry, to try and rehabilitate Henry, or to keep Henry out of jail. I simply used him as a witness, and in return, I brought to the authorities' attention on the West Coast the help that he had provided to us. I brought to the attention of other prosecution authorities in other locations, in drunk driving cases and things like that. I got in touch with them, told them who he was, but never sought to have Henry, not go to prison because of the fact that he had helped us. I mean, I brought his cooperation to their attention and took no position with respect to any of the cases that there was only one real case, and that was the narcotics case. The other stuff was things that he could have done 15 days in jail or something like that for drunk and disorderly.
But it wasn't merely the fact that he would have definitely have been sentenced to a very long stretch, but more perilous was the fact that they would have killed him. Barrio or the Burke crew.
Well, they're going back to when he was first cooperating with us. We worked out a deal with him when he first came forward, and we wanted to get his cooperation. And we worked out the deal, including the Nassau County District Attorney's Office. And they agreed that they would not prosecute him. We agreed that we would not prosecute him for the various things he had been involved with, which could have been the subject of federal prosecutions. And we gave him complete immunity. I look back on that 30 years later. I look back on it probably 5 years after the fact, and I made a very serious mistake. There was no way in a million years that Henry Hill should have received immunity for the cooperation that he provided us. Henry should have gone to prison at the time that he cooperated. He should have gone to prison either for the narcotics cases that he had been involved in with Nassau County, or for some of the other things that he had done with Jimmy Burke.
You were too generous and liberal with the blanket immunity that you agreed to give him in exchange for his cooperation.
Yeah, in hindsight, I realized that I went overboard. I mean, I didn't make the final decision. It had to be made. The decision had to be supported by my superiors, but they followed my recommendation, and my recommendation was that he'd be immunized. He not be prosecuted for the various things that he did. The Nassau County District Attorney's went along with it. District Attorney's Office went along with it. But I look back and I say, I had to be. I was very involved in this whole thing. I guess there was an emotional involvement. The agents had an emotional involvement, and we looked at Henry at the time as someone who was going to be. Now you see that many family bosses, underbosses, capos, maid guys are cooperating. At that time, in 1980, when Henry came forward, I think that there was Jimmy Fratiano, who was a guy from the West Coast. People think he might not even been a main guy, but he cooperated. He was supposedly the boss of the family in Los Angeles, but that was not a major family. He cooperated. Joe Valachi cooperated back in the early '60s. But other than that, there had never been a major organized crime figure who had come in and had testified.
There was a Jewish mobster up high in the hierarchy who had agreed to cooperate, and they threw him out of a
you talk about Abe Rellis, the Half Moon Hotel in Colorado. But we viewed Henry as being somebody who was going to be a very significant witness, and he was. But I think that I guess it's the Alan Greenspan's phrase was irrational exuberance, something to that effect. I think that's probably what we were guilty of, and Henry should have done some jail time.
Well, were there possibly perhaps some underlying good virtues that you recognized in Henry, and you were very gratuitous in the blanket immunity, perhaps?
I didn't recognize any virtues in Henry at all at the time we gave him immunity. The only virtue he had was that he looked like he could be an excellent witness for us.
Which he turned out to be.
He turned out to be, but there was no. I didn't know Henry at the time, and it wasn't that I sort of liked him or I felt sorry for him or I was charmed by him. The decision was made in a matter of a day or two that we were going to give him immunity, and we didn't have any time really to develop a relationship with him or have any rapport with him. We knew that the information he was supplying from the FBI's investigation was going to corroborate other things that we had, and we felt confident that he was going to be making some cases. He was recording conversations with some major narcotics traffickers, while we were negotiating what he was doing. So he was proving his value while we were negotiating what the settlement or the disposition was going to be, what his deal was going to be. So it's not that he charmed us and won us over. We were simply looking at what he was going to provide. And again, in hindsight, he had no choice. If we said, Henry, you're going to have to do 5 years, he'd have to accept it. And, so you make mistakes.
It was simply a sound business decision.
Well, it was an unsound business decision. It was a business decision. But looking back with the hindsight of about